Well, good afternoon, Thomas. I'm not sure if I'm the one leading off with this, but just wanted to introduce our session today, Getting Clarity for Your Strata Depreciation Reports. I'm the fellow on the left, that emoji that looks like a younger version of the Dos Equis man, I think. So it's very complimentary. Thank you for that. And Thomas, thank you for hosting this today.
Oh, thanks so much, Mike. We're delighted to have you. My cartoon is also great. It started when I had an old one, and I'm like, you no longer look like me. The hair color's wrong, but it does make for some great cartoons.
Absolutely.
We're here to talk about a very important and very timely subject, which I see the title here reflects a little more than the subject matter, because getting clarity for your strata depreciation reports speaks to what you do at Clarity. Take it away, Mike.
Sure. Well, thank you, Thomas. So our firm, Clarity Reserve Solutions, kind of more commonly known as Clarity RS, also works in British Columbia under the DBA of NLD Consulting. So we have been a firm conducting market value appraisals, replacement cost insurance appraisals, going back 31 years. And about 15, 16 years ago, we delved into the realm of reserve fund studies, which at the time in British Columbia became depreciation reports when we're speaking to strata corporations. Now, we worked from, let's say, 2011 onwards under a regime where it was an optional 3-year update cycle for depreciation reports. And we've more recently, as of July 1st, 2024, moved into a mandatory 5-year update cycle for all strata corporations with 5 units or greater.
So the clock is ticking. What does this mean for those stratas in the Lower Mainland?
So what it means is there's a few different potential deadlines. So for strata corporations that existed prior to July 1st, 2024, so more than a year and a half old, let's say, and had not conducted a depreciation report since January 1st of 2021, there is a deadline that is in about 160 days if those stratas are located either in the Capital Regional District, which is Greater Victoria, let's say, and beyond, or the Vancouver Regional District, or the Fraser Valley Regional District. There are a few exceptions. Southern Gulf Islands, as an example, Bowen Island, as an example. If you are in one of those regional districts, but you are only boat access or even plane access, but you can't drive there, of course, excluding Vancouver Island, then your deadline is 1 year later. So for the majority of strata corporations in these metro areas who have not conducted a depreciation report since December 31st, 2020, their deadline is 160 days out. It's going to be June 30th of this year. For the rest of the province, it is 1 year later, June 30th of 2027.
So we had Jonathan Fenn of Reserve Sense on in the fall, and at that point he said, call now. You've got to get this in. Obviously, your teams will be quite engaged going through these now for all of these buildings. What are the chances that somebody who is supposed to have a report by this June can get one at this point? And what should they be doing, and who should they be calling?
Sure, great question, Thomas. So I would say the chances are still pretty good if you're in one of those, areas, one of those urban areas that needs the report. Now, I can say that today, but what happens if the industry gets overwhelmed, in the next 3 weeks? So it's very time sensitive, this answer. I'm going to say that from April 2024, by the time we hit July, when the new regs came into force, we saw an uptick of approximately as much as quadruple the number of proposal requests. Now, one might extrapolate that quadruple the proposal requests might lead to quadruple the number of active orders. In the past, there were 3 things that could have happened when we did a proposal. They chose us, yay. They chose a friendly competitor, good for them. Or thirdly, they did nothing. They waived the requirement and did no report. That third scenario no longer exists. So if we get a request for proposal or a friendly competitor does, that report is going to land somewhere, even if they wait an extra 6 months or a year. So there's a bit of an unknown. The number of of firms and qualified individuals at those firms that do this type of work is, of course, finite. There are perhaps a few dozen firms that do this work, perhaps several dozen individuals at those firms doing this work. So in British Columbia, we have over 34,000 strata corporations in BC, including duplex, triplex, fourplex, which are exempt from the requirement. So when we go to that subcategory of 5 strata lots or greater, which are required to meet these regulations, we might be in the 15 to 18 or 20,000 strata corporation range. How many of those already have their report and it's very current, it's only a couple years old? How many of those have never conducted a depreciation report and fall within this 160-day deadline? So I suspect that the tides will turn as spring AGMs, get underway, and strata corporations who maybe have not yet addressed the issue, maybe are working to budget their, a depreciation report resolution to pay for it. I suspect there could be a massive uptick come this spring, and the regulation and the act, and you have to read the two together, but the language they use is obtain a depreciation report. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and the word obtain can be thought of in different ways. I have an opinion. Obtain the report means have a signed report, not have draft 3, have the signed finalized report. So you need a lead time, and we've been trying to press forward with encouraging people, whether they select us, whether they select a friendly competitor, get this process underway as soon as possible. I was saying that a year ago. Obviously, the timelines are shortening.
Yeah, they're shortening, but it's important. And I think that we can quibble over what the terminology means. The reality is there aren't many strata police out there wandering around going, do you have your report? But for those owners in your community, when they are attempting to sell their property, the expectation on the part of a buyer is that that strata is compliant. And, the questions are going to come. Hey, where is your depreciation report? This one's from 2013. So you've got to get that process underway, and you're doing yourself a real disservice if you're relying on a document that's that old to guide any of your future expectations or work. My feeling about a building is that it lives and breathes every day with the rest of us. And so, yes, it's a great snapshot in time, but having that evolve as your building evolves is really important. And while they've switched from a 3-year recommended to a 5-year maximum cycle, I'm still hoping a lot of buildings, especially those that are more substantial, with a lot more building components and a lot more people, stick on that 3-year cycle because it's good for them and it helps them proactively plan.
No, I agree. If it was a 7-unit bare land strata with very limited services, site improvements, some underground services, they might feel, oh boy, we don't need this even every 5 years, but now it's an obligation. Whereas a complex, sectioned, physically integrated high rise with multiple uses, first of all, there's a lot of legal complexity to even understanding scope of work within the context of the depreciation report. And those systems, and I think of a building, you said it's not just a static entity. I think of it as a machine, right? Just like a car is a machine. Things wear out. It's not buy it and you're done. It's you have to plan for these life cycles. And the more complex that machine, in this case, that building, the more frequently you may want to reassess the funding plan, the funding models, just to make sure you're staying on track.
You mentioned, Mike, that there's only a few dozen firms and potentially a few dozen people at those firms that are now qualified to write these. It used to be that anyone with knowledge and expertise could put one of these reports together, and maybe for that 7-unit bare land strata, that was an okay way to go. Who's qualified now, and why did they make that change?
Certainly, great question. So the prior regulation was a bit of a circular logic. A qualified individual is one who has the skills, knowledge, and qualifications, I'm question mark with that, to conduct these, and that the strata corporation is confident has those skills. So it didn't really define it well. And I understand if we put ourselves back to 2010, 2011, it was an industry in its infancy. At the time, there were literally only two designations in Canada that had a standard with respect to reserve fund studies: Appraisal Institute of Canada and the Real Estate Institute of Canada's Certified Reserve Planner designation, CRP. And there were zero CRPs in BC. So it was a domain, let's say, of engineering firms on the rare occasion when these reports were requested, usually for a complex building. So it was really an industry that was not yet well formed. So in order to have practitioners, it was a very loose requirement, let's say. But then when July 1st, 2024 regulations dropped, it gave 1 year till July 1st of 2025 for those in need of this service and or those providers to attain one or more designation that is qualified. And that includes professional engineers in British Columbia, architects, I'm sort of paraphrasing these, architects in BC, those registered with the Applied Science Technologists and Technicians of British Columbia, an AACI, so accredited appraiser, Canadian Institute through the Appraisal Institute of Canada, Certified Reserve Planner, CRP, through the Real Estate Institute of Canada, and lastly, a quantity surveyor. So there's now these 6 categories. They align very similarly to what we see in other jurisdictions across the country. We work in several provinces and 1 territory. You find some similarities across the board to who can do this work.
Excellent. As we go through the alphabet, you mentioned a couple of the designations that I see there after your name. Can you tell us what the others are?
Sure. So PAP, Professional Appraiser, and AACI, Accredited Appraiser, Canadian Institute, they kind of go together. You can't have one without the other. They're both Appraisal Institute of Canada designations. Appraisal Institute of Canada does have a professional standard for reserve fund planning. However, education needs to occur, and I can talk about that more sort of outside the purview of the AIC directly. CRP, Certified Reserve Planner, it is the one Canadian designation that is specific to conducting reserve fund studies, and depreciation reports are reserve fund studies within the context of strata property. RI, member of the Real Estate Institute of British Columbia, and then PRA is actually a US-based but international designation for conducting reserve fund studies as well. So we kind of learn from our neighbors and colleagues elsewhere.
Very good. Now, the value of having one of these reports goes beyond ticking the regulatory box. Talk to us at a high level. What are they going to get from this depreciation report? We've talked about between ourselves how BC's terminology is a bit different, but this is a reserve study or a reserve fund study, as it's called across most jurisdictions in North America. So tell us the value that they get out of receiving this document and why they're paying for it.
Certainly. And I think what I'll start off with kind of a layperson definition. I can give you the most concise definition I can give you is it's a plan, but that's not really an adequate definition. I can give a way better definition with 2 words. It's a financial plan. It's about the money. Now that may seem counterintuitive because are we not required to inspect the property? Yes. Visually inspect where practical the components? Yes. The reason that occurs is it informs us as to which components are within scope or out of scope, what their life cycle is, what the next most likely replacement date is within that life cycle, what the scope of work that relates to that life cycle is, and what the predicted cost in current dollars, and of course, construction inflated future dollars is. For each of those variables, I'm going to say, and this is getting a little philosophical, my goal is to be 50-50, that I overestimate versus underestimate each variable. Life cycle, where you are in the life cycle, scope of work, and cost. You build your models, your funding models from all of that knowledge. So it does require understanding and experience in the building systems. One might be a generalist. I don't know as much as the HVAC contractor, nor the elevator contractor, nor the roofing contractor, but I understand how these all come together, or my team understands how these all come together to build a funding model for the future. the depreciation report requires a 30-year outlook. Think of it as a window into the predicted future of 30 years. The building's still there at year 31, presumably, but you're just looking at this snapshot. And you're building at least 3 different funding model scenarios for the Strata Corporation to consider. Now, the only rule in terms of funding is that a Strata Corporation contributes at least 10% of the equivalent of their operating budget for the current fiscal year into the CRF. That is a very low threshold. It's better than nothing.
I'm looking crestfallen because I don't understand how an operating budget reflects their upcoming capital requirements. And I am aware of how woefully inadequate that is. Our latest data suggests that the average in British Columbia is on the order of 15 to 16% of the operating budget, which is above the minimum, but not nearly enough. And you see other jurisdictions like Ontario, where they have the adequate funding requirement, contributing well over 30, 35% of their operating budget every single year. And that is obviously reflected in their condo fees, but it's also reflected in the absence or substantially fewer special assessments versus the special levies that we see here.
Yes, absolutely. And it's, we in British Columbia, I'm going to say, sort of suffered a delayed regulation. We were going through leaky condo issues, in the 90s, the earlier 2000s, and other provinces got a decade head start on us, Alberta, Ontario, as you mentioned. So even the pathway working more towards adequate funding is a journey. It's an evolution of people's thinking.
It is.
We hear the same comments very often about, why am I concerned about what's going to happen in 10 years when I plan to sell in 5, in terms of the risk of special levies.
Yep. And pass the buck to the next guy, right, Mike?
Yes. Well, and one thing I do want to add, myself and one of my business partners were, over the last dozen or so years, we've been the instructors for a course across the province for real estate boards, across the province, on understanding strata depreciation reports, how to read them, because they look very different. And one of the takeaways is really, if you're working as a realtor with a potential buyer, well, what are the risks of special levy comparatively? If you look at, strata A versus strata B, and you like them both, but you just don't innately know the financial considerations until you've been able to review a document such as the depreciation report. And if you see that one is very risky of multiple special levies in the nearer term and the other is less risky, well, that might help inform you as to your decision. So these reports don't exist in a vacuum. So Thomas, I want to go back to, what does the strata get out of this? I might even touch upon the strata police comment. Ideally, these reports are not just a tick box, as you noted, that sit on a shelf, because that's a several $1,000 tick box in most cases. Wouldn't it be ideal if the Strata Corporation not only ticked the box, but then had a document that is helping them, achieve their goals? Their goals may be to reduce the likelihood of special levies or, sporadic huge cash calls. Their goal might be to take a reasonable period of years to adapt to the reality of higher contributions into the CRF. Those two goals, of course, counteract each other. You can't have low fees and low risk. There's going to be some sort of compromise in effect. And if they have a report that has prepared 3 funding models, maybe one shows them the path they're already on, increasing at CPI inflation. Maybe that's riddled with predicted special levies. Maybe at the other extreme, they see a path that achieves full funding before year 30, and it reduces risk of special levies in terms of magnitude and frequency. But of course, it's going to increase those monthly CRF contributions more rapidly. What is in the middle of those two? I don't mean the mathematical average of the two, but somewhere between those extremes. Is there a pathway that serves the majority of owners well? It reduces the risk of special levy, magnitude and frequency. The optics are nicer for any buyer, and of course, therefore, for any seller looking to sell their unit. And it gives those owners adequate time to prepare for those expenditures, rather than writing a big check all at once, maybe every month they're paying a bit more.
Right. So that's what a report can do for you, is help you find that place that will let you plan and make the best decision for your community based on their collective needs, in the absence of there being dictated rules about adequate funding as they have in Ontario.
Absolutely. And ideally, the report could potentially, when you're planning out your major projects in a more organized fashion in advance, there could be cost savings because you're not doing things in a chronic rush at the last moment. So being prepared, there is this saying, what gets measured gets managed. Was a lot of things getting measured in these reports, so to speak.
Yeah.
So whether you have a professional property manager or you're a self-managed strata corporation, you're going to be able to glean ideally some good data from the report. Touching on the strata police, this comes up a lot in these courses for the real estate boards. Who are the strata police? And again, as a non-lawyer and just kind of giving a judgment call on this, I'm sitting before a room of maybe 60 or 70 realtors, and I say, imagine you're all the owners in a single strata corporation, and you're following the rule, the rules of the Strata Act and regulation, generally speaking, but you decide not to bother with the depreciation report requirement. You just cherry pick because it's new. Let's not worry about it because nobody's policing us per se. And my comeback is the police could be nobody, or it could be anybody in this room that has a sale collapse because when the Form B is requested and requests the most recent depreciation report, if any, and you're now at a point where it's mandatory and you don't provide it and the sale collapses for whatever the purchaser's reasons, somebody's not going to be very happy if they wait 6 more months and sell it $100,000 less. They're going to be looking for somebody to blame. One of the fingers kind of has to point at oneself, perhaps, but the rest of the strata owners collectively you might point to.
Yeah. The Strata Council has a burden of reasonable duties. This is a very reasonable thing for them to do, to follow the act. There's been plenty of discussion about this rule coming in for several years. It is time to take action. So I hope that they do that, because you don't want to find yourself, facing a case and becoming the one that establishes case law around what happens if you're not compliant with these rules.
Absolutely.
Talk to me about what other value an owner can get out of the reserve fund study depreciation report here in BC, and what's Clarity's approach to that? How are you trying to provide more clarity versus one of the friendly competitors that you've alluded to earlier?
Certainly. So I would hope that, so our rule book, so to speak, begins with the Strata Property Act and regulation. And building upon that, depending which of the 6 designations, and of course there are people such as myself that hold more than one of those 6 potential designations. Nobody has them all, but any one will suffice. But if you have professional standards, they may require additional mandatory content to go in the depreciation report. One example is this concept of a benchmark analysis. Without a benchmark analysis, the report becomes more of just a tracking of cash flow. Are you running out of money or not during this 30-year window? And year 31 might be set up for failure because you're only looking at cash flow, adequate money to maintain during that 30 years without this concept of full funding, where you are. If we think about percent funded, and you noted, the majority of strata corporations maybe being at 15 or 16, 17% funded, that is unknowable unless a benchmark analysis is conducted as part of the depreciation report. One of the really good attributes of the regulation is language that requires the consultant to include any other content they feel is necessary and beneficial to that strata corporation. So conducting a benchmark analysis, which gives you this concept of theoretical full funding, now you can measure where the strata is against that barometer. So when we're preparing a draft, and these reports almost always go through a first, second draft, et cetera, before finalizing, because first of all, you want to confirm all the facts are complete and accurate. And there's so many variables in these reports there's an expectation that that's going to involve some back and forth with council or management, let's say. Next, you want to discuss the priorities of funding models with that strata council or whoever the representatives are.
Absolutely.
Ideally, some are very arm's length and are not so concerned about having those discussions. And ideally, the consultant would approach it that, well, what is the best balance? If we create a model, and we call it the adequate model, but that's just our internal language, that tries to balance different kinds of risk. One risk is special levy, the frequency and the magnitude of a special levy. Another risk is, boy, we contributed more than we needed to, and there was no risk of special levy. Why did we go and do that in hindsight? So people will.
That doesn't seem to be a common problem, though, Mike. Based on what we've seen, this is not a common predicament.
It is rare. It happens quite by accident when it does happen, and I have seen strata corporations oddly funded at over 100%, and it was because their obligations were so limited because of contracts, maintenance contracts, etc. They were operating budget. Anyways, going down a rabbit hole there, but
no, this is good. I'm just trying to see if I can't find a little supporting information to quantify the number of that situation that we've seen out of the total pool, because it is quite an interesting and rare number if you look at it that way. According to our numbers, about 17 of nearly 7,000 find themselves mathematically in that position based on a bunch of our assumptions today. So we are talking about what I would say is a minute number in terms of their current in the bank funding. And then when you look at the overall picture, it is more rosy. Those that look like they will be better than 100% funded when you look out, and I prefer this. We have an internal measure we call overall reserve fund adequacy. There are about 1,800 of nearly 7,000 stratas that find themselves in mathematically good shape. And that's a happy number and a great place to be. And I hope that we see more approaching that standard in the future. But there are a lot of assumptions that we have to make to come up with what that looks like. And you and I haven't talked about this, but we have our own little measure at OctoAI of a special levy forecast. And we make all sorts of assumptions, including that the latest depreciation report, which in some cases is more than a decade old, is going to hold from this date into the future, which is hugely unrealistic in the situation of a historic report like that. And that their latest reserve fund balance is what we know it to be, and that their latest budget contribution is reflective of their future contribution subject to inflation. So we make all sorts of assumptions. But it does help create a picture of when and where those levies will be. And that's this little talk that I just gave about that maybe 1,800 of the 7,000 stratas look in good shape, is one of the byproducts of all of that work that we've done.
No, that's great. Yes. And you can build these algorithms and stress test them on, what is the risk that we've underestimated the long-term construction inflation, or we've overestimated interest earned on money, or et cetera. And I know you've talked to John Fenn. You mentioned John, and John's a colleague.
I did, yeah.
Runs Reserve Sense, the software we use to prepare these depreciation reports. And really deep dives on this type of information, because as we see more and more strata corporations in BC, and of course condo corporations in general in other jurisdictions, have these reports conducted, more and more data becomes available to be predictive in nature. I'm going to bring it back to sort of maybe the less the macro scale and more the micro scale for any given strata. Let's imagine, and I'm going to use my little up-down again.
Yeah, you're 50-50.
That's like a flip of a coin. Imagine I'm flipping a coin. Heads, I was wrong on the high side. Tails, I was wrong on the low side. If my coin lands on edge, I guess I was right. Occasionally that could happen. But it's predictive in nature. There's no future facts. They're all predictions. What you're going to have for breakfast tomorrow is a prediction. You don't know. So we make these predictions, not the worst case scenario, which would mean you'd need all the money in the world to fund it. Not the best case scenario, which is you never spend anything. But imagine on a bell curve, we want to be zero standard deviations, right in the middle of that bell curve. The greatest likelihood, if I have one component and it's a flip of a coin that I'm high or low, it's 50-50. kind of, right? If that's the goal.
And this is the same for everything, right? Like the not only the cost of replacing the roof, but also the expected life of the roof.
Yes, and the scope. Now, roof is likely, 100% of the scope of work. But let's say it's plumbing. I often refer to it as component X in the course for realtors. And I come clean and I say, I'm talking about plumbing. I say, what if in 25 years, two outcomes are possible? Complete replacement, or you don't need to spend anything. Now, that's not literally the way plumbing works, but it's just kind of the closest example, which is, should you reserve 100%, 0%, some other percent? And I say, well, if you reserve 50%, I'm a glass half full kind of guy, so I'm half right. It means I'm also half wrong in that case. But when you only have one decision, that probability doesn't work well in your favor. 50-50, you're wrong high or wrong low. If I have 75 components to analyze, and granted, they're not all going to be the same magnitude and, of course, different lifespans, but that's 75 flips of a coin. One thing I know with certainty, I'm not flipping 75 heads.
Yeah.
Not flipping 75 tails. So the model actually gets really strong the more variables we analyze, not because we're all amazing, but because probabilities work in our favor. And that's the way the modeling gets very strong. I have high degrees of confidence in the overall model, even though each granular little prediction is a flip of a coin.
So that's you've got 75 variables. One of them is the roof. One of them is the plumbing system. One of them is the elevators. You're flipping those coins. And yes, the roof lasted longer, but the plumbing system lasted less. And on the whole, those numbers as a result tend to be reasonably accurate.
Yes. And what it also establishes when you have, because 75 components doesn't create 75 CRF funds, it's one fund. Even if they give it 2 or 3 names, paint fund, roof fund, in our world, that's all one CRF. That's what you have.
Mine too.
Yeah. And in the end, you might be at 35% funded, but you still have adequate dollars to fund the imminent expenditure because you're using money that's earmarked for other future expenditures. But you're always doing that into the future. I'm going to sort of ask a hypothetical, sort of philosophical maybe question here. Yeah. How much money, what does fully funded look like in the CRF the last day before the strata plan gets canceled and sold off to a developer? What is the fully funded CRF balance at the end of the building's life?
That's a really great question. I mean, my answer is it doesn't matter what that number is because it's going to be prorated out to the owners in their allocation. Right?
Right. But what is the need? So you might have a bunch of money in there, but what is the need? There's one number. It's zero.
Oh, yeah. The number is zero. You don't need it. But of course, by that point, you've come down a long road and hopefully your plumbing wasn't dripping and your roof wasn't leaking on that last day as you sold it to the developer. So exactly. I hear you. The math and the answer is very clear. It is zero. But how did you get to that exact day and get it to that point? And I don't know. What is the philosophical answer to that?
Well, again, I think it's sort of theoretical because, as you say, we don't know when that day arrives. But if one did know, let's say it was a leasehold property. I'm going to talk generically here outside the Strata Property Act. So a reserve fund study on a homeowners corporation on leasehold land, and it turns over after 60 years back to the land owner. And there's no requirement to continue to maintain it. If you could know that, theoretically, your contributions would have risen in the earlier life of the building, and then decreased. You eventually put on the last roof. You eventually do the last balcony membranes. You eventually paint it one last time, and you don't save for the next time that never comes. Yes, you do have to maintain it so you don't have leaks springing up. Yeah. So ideally, you don't have a need for a massive repiping 5 years before of end of life, and the end of life in this case being determined contractually, not physical, not that the building's falling down, but it's an interesting concept. So the contributions that one makes don't need to achieve this theoretical full funding to necessarily mitigate risk of special levy, but there's not an easy rule of thumb. I can't look at a building and know, oh yeah, this one easy street versus they're going to have problems, because you need to know the life, where each component is in its lifespan.
We, of course, have the same problem when we try and look at things from the perspective of a strata corporation. One of the tools within our annual benchmark report tells you what the CRF contribution theoretically would need to be this year and then grow going forward to net the levies over the 30-year life of your depreciation report to zero. Of course, that doesn't work either, because if your big project is in year 23, then you're short in year 23 and you've got all this extra money in the bank at the end. But
yes,
and nor does the 30-year period represent any kind of date of finality to your community or your building. You might have something very big happening in year 31. So life is tricky, and you live in that space, so you see it.
yes. And your example, that just triggers something in my mind. I know in some jurisdictions, sometimes we see reports where they need to look at a 25 or a 30-year window, but they are completely ignoring the obligation at year 31. Let's say a 30-year window, year 31. And let's say it's a high-rise curtain wall system that's going to be $40 million 31 years from now to replace. In my opinion, it would be inappropriate to not have captured 31ths or 31sts of that in my model, because my model is going to be so wrong in 5 years when the update comes, and year 31 is now year 26. So the math is not always all equal in the industry. If it, so long as somebody's holding the professional designation, has the professional training for reserve fund studies, that's great. Whether they're a CRP or an ACI that have that in the standards, or I have, a very close friend who's a PEng and he's a CRP as well, and that's great. So sometimes combinations of designations work well. Nationally, the program, and it's actually, there's nothing like it even in the US, because again, I'm a PRA, which is a US designation. There is nothing that touches the UBC Sauder School of Business program for reserve planning, and one can take that to its fruition and get their CRP, or just take the core courses to gain some competency. And our friend John, again, that we were speaking of earlier, is the head instructor of that program. So there is really good education in Canada,
Yes.
And it just so happens to be, UBC, but it's provided to members, or interested consultants from coast to coast.
They have great real estate programs there as well. So
yes.
So, a question for you that's come up in my mind, and you said I could surprise you with one. Let's just say we're looking at a building that's from the late 50s and it's 18 stories tall.
Yes.
At what point do you try and make that there is an end of life just physically for this building calculation?
Okay, well, so if it's from the 1950s and if it's in Vancouver, it's an equity co-op, unless it was a strata conversion, because we have no stratas that old unless they were converted.
Exactly, yeah.
And we do have some, obviously, that have been converted older buildings.
Yeah.
But what happens from time to time, again, I'm a generalist. People in this industry might come from an engineering background, but what type of, are they a structural engineer? Are they an electrical engineer? Well, whatever it may be. So we always have areas where our knowledge is limited to the degree that we need to suggest that other experts get engaged for those specific things. So if we're thinking end of life, if we're talking, and I don't remember if you said 18-story, 1950s, concrete, high-rise, downtown Vancouver, if it's maintained, the lifespan of that building, even from now, if it's 70 years old, whatever that makes it, the lifespan from now ideally would still go beyond not only the 30-year window we need to look at, but whatever the next replacement of a component is. We never have to reserve for all of the replacements. We only have to reserve for the replacement of the component's lifespan we are in the midst of. So if the longest lifespan we were addressing was 40 years and we're 20 years into it, well, we got to figure out the rest of that 20 years plus the next 10 to bring us to 30. So it's a little bit moot in terms, I'm not trying to totally avoid the question. I'm just thinking it through here. Now I'm going to put on my appraiser hat for a moment. We have another concept called highest and best use. And that is where alternative uses of land suggest that you would redevelop a site. We see this happening with low density townhouse projects quite often. One near Cambion Marine, for example, because you can put a high rise up instead of this 45-year-old townhouse. But we cannot make those uncertain predictions in such a way that would leave a strata corporation without a funding model that would adequately address that not occurring. There's no guarantee it's going to occur unless or until there's a contract in place that then maybe there's an argument to provide funding models to consider that.
That scenario that you mentioned, I saw a strata trying to list itself for sale, that the buildings were 20 something years old, but now it's by a SkyTrain station. So that possibility of density is there. And I was like, wow, I can't believe such good homes are already being considered for that, given how young they are. And I can say that about something that's 25 because I'm much older.
Sure.
But one more sort of theoretical discussion topic, I think, before I'm out of ideas. And I mean, I'm not. We could talk forever. But this tension between having a mandatory report, but then not having to act on it because you're making suggestions, you're providing some timelines, but they don't actually have to listen to that. The minimum contribution is 10% of the operating budget. And how do you resolve that tension?
Well, one thing, and this really, varies by strata corporation personalities, let's say, that engage with whoever the consultant's going to be. Ideally, they want to have these conversations, understand the pros and cons of different pathways. My goal is to be able to provide them a model that ideally they would consider implementing, because ideally it puts them on a better path than the default they were already on. Since the regulation does not require them to follow any recommendation, nor does it even require us to make a recommendation. We do that at our option. We do it all the time, but that's not a mandatory requirement. Then you're not giving much guidance if you just plop down three draconian models, maybe, that they're left not knowing where to go. So ideally, there's some interaction between council members and or even at an AGM. It could be a Zoom meeting, whatever, where they might want the consultant to debrief what the report is about. But when you say they don't necessarily act on it, yes, it's a case of slowly moving people in a better direction, perhaps, than the default. So you're doing good still. But there's a couple of nice little side effects of having the report. One is you get to see what's coming on the horizon, so you can ideally start to plan for it. If it's a major expenditure, the roof, the plumbing, balcony slab edge repair, whatever that case may be, because some of these are very expensive, undertakings, and perhaps there's a way to manage those without special levies if you're planning far enough in advance. One other side effect, and of course, when depreciation reports were optional, this would work for those stratas that had a depreciation report and would not work at all for those who didn't. But the voting threshold to spend money from the CRF changes when there is a depreciation report. Without a depreciation report, 3/4 vote of the owners forming a quorum at an AGM or an SGM to pass that vote. So 3 out of 4 people at that AGM. That drops to a simple majority vote when the item forms the component or part of a component identified in a depreciation report. So for those stratas that have a bit of dysfunction where 2/3 agree on things, well, you easily pass the 50+1 vote, but you're not attaining the 3/4 vote. The depreciation report will aid in that success, let's say, of that small majority.
Right. That is a very good point. I hadn't really thought that through. I haven't lived it inside of that situation where you're trying to get those thresholds. And there are a lot of discussions about spending at critical thresholds, and there have been in recent years with bigger new things coming in that weren't around when they designed some of these rules. You think about all the EV infrastructure, for example.
Absolutely.
Frequent talking points. Mike, are there other topics that you'd like to cover today?
I think, again, that the one thing I would, I want this to be helpful, not just a pitch from my perspective. So For those stratas that have not yet addressed, that have 5 units or greater, they either have a deadline coming in the next 160 days because they're in the Greater Vancouver or Fraser Valley or Capital Regional District, excluding those islands noted. Please start reaching out to consultants. Find them as you may. If you are professionally managed, your property manager may be able to give some names. If you're self-managed or even professionally managed and you're undertaking that as a council, there's a few good resources. CHOA, the Condominium Homeowners Association of BC, BC-wide, many strata corporations are members, and many professional members of CHOA conduct this type of work. You can also go to the Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association if one is on the island, and they also have a directory of professional members. You can reach out through even CCI BC. So there's a number of resources aside from doing your Google search and looking that way. But I would say that it's prudent to get, at least 3 or 4 proposals. Even if you have an incumbent that did it 5 or 7 or 9 years ago, get some fresh proposals from them as well, perhaps, and others. Compare sample reports. And if there's a chance or an opportunity to have a conversation with those consultants, see what the fit feels like. See if you communicate well with them and if they communicate well with you. Unless your goal is just to tick a box, an expensive box, then maybe those conversations aren't top of mind. But I would say doing that due diligence quickly is a good idea.
That is a great idea. Of course, I did bring up the QR code, so those that are watching can go to Clarity's website to learn more. Mike, you mentioned another website with some great information
Sure.
that they might want to visit.
Thank you. So Clarity is our national brand, national identity that we formed in 2024. But many people will know us by our long-standing brand, which is NLD Consulting. N like Nancy, L D like dog. Consulting. And that website is reserveadvisors.ca. So advisors is SORS, so the plural, reserveadvisors.ca. That is the site that is going to give greater detail specific to British Columbia on the act, the regulations, who's qualified, geographic competence, and of course the ability to request a proposal. At a minimum, we need to know who is the contact for the proposal and what is the strata corporation number. We don't need more info than that to be able to put a proposal together, but feel free to fill out more fields if one wants. And also, of course, go to other professionals to see who is the best fit. We'd love to be the best fit, but if there's reasons that one wants to go with another professional, do that due diligence.
You guys are going to be busy too. So you have a lot of great friendly competitors out there in the space. Everyone's got a lot of work to do. It's important work. We hope that it's done well, and we hope that these communities can all leverage what they're learning by getting these updated depreciation reports to make more informed decisions for their communities about their futures.
Absolutely.
Mike, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Thomas.
And next week, Condo Talk will return with Quinn Trapp of Atlas to talk about what it takes to get and stay pest-free. So always something fun